Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. This week we're joined by David Kaufmann and Michael Wicki, and we're talking about their research on how different project characteristics and planning instruments affect people's support for densification in 6 major cities in the US and Europe. Project characteristics can be things like the size and location of a building and the type of developer building it, and planning instruments can be things like inclusionary zoning or different levels of community engagement. I think the importance of this research speaks for itself. Building more and denser housing in our existing cities is critical for everything from housing affordability to sustainability to economic opportunity. And as I'm fond of saying, the major challenge in housing policy is not identifying the things that will help us achieve those goals. It's convincing a majority of voters that those are things worth doing. I'm going to leave it at that, make this quick, because I am headed out the door to LAX for a 9-day trip to Japan, where I will be when this episode comes out, and where attitudes toward densification seem radically different to ours here on the other side of the Pacific. I am very excited, and hopefully I learn a thing or two that I can take back with me. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, with production support from Claudia Bustamante, Jason Suteja, and Gavin Carlson. If you have a question or show idea, send it to me at shanephillips@ucla.edu. And with that, let's get to our conversation with David Kaufmann and Michael Wicki. David Kaufmann is Assistant Professor of Spatial Development and Urban Policy at ETH Zurich, a university in Switzerland, and Michael Wicki is a senior researcher at the same. They're joining us today to talk about their research into the factors that affect people's acceptance of dense housing development in major cities in the US and Europe, and how certain planning tools or instruments can be used to increase public acceptance of density. David and Michael, thanks for joining us, and welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Thanks for having us.
And my co-author for this one is Paavo. You may be able to tell we have some European guests, and Paavo is on sabbatical there this year, so he's meeting lots of folks and setting up lots of interviews. Hey, Paavo.
Hey, Shane. How's it going? Good to see you. Thanks for waking up early. Hi, Michael and David. It's so great that you can join us and talk about this very interesting research, and I'm looking forward to visiting ETH Zurich in a few weeks.
Yeah, and this is our chance to get some sweet European tours. So every guest, we ask for just a few minutes of a tour of a city that they've lived in, that they know well, whether it's where you live now in Zurich or elsewhere. So maybe David, we'll start with you. Where do you want to take us around?
Yes, so when fellow urbanists or housing scholars or planning scholars come by and visit us, so we mostly try to take you on a tour through Zurich. So I'm living in Zurich since my early 20s. I grew up outside of Zurich, but now I'm in Zurich for almost 20 years. The center of Zurich has like 450,000 inhabitants, and it's the center of a metropolitan region between 1.5 and 2 million inhabitants. During the days, I have 2 small kids, so I would take you to one of the community centers. We have a lot of community centers. It's a polycentric city, Zurich. And the little community centers, they are mostly like a park with playgrounds. We have workshops there, like little cafes. And in my community center next to my house, we have also a little animal zoo, and the creek runs through it. So it's very green and very family-oriented where I'm living, but it's still rather central. And then probably later, because you're housing folks, we would take you to a visit of 1 or 2 of the housing cooperatives in Zurich. We have a very different one, like old established one that have like garden type of city vibes, so like old housing, not so dense, but in a very, very distinguished time period. And then maybe also a very new one that tries to experiment with new ways of living, co-living activities. So we were gonna visit them. And then at night, Paavo, when you come, then we will go to the so-called Long Street. It's an area to go out with different restaurant bars and even clubs. Wide variety of fancy cocktail bars to more rundown bars. And there, I think it's the Zurich becomes most urban, especially like at weekend nights.
I do feel like the dense urban cities in Europe are much better than the dense-ish urban cities in the US at kind of for having children, basically. They're much better at supporting families. than the cities we've got here, unfortunately. I hear, is it Switzerland or maybe Zurich specifically I'm thinking of, kind of has a very, things shut down pretty early, talking like 11, 12 p.m. even on a weekend, or what do things look like there?
No. We can go out later than midnight.
Okay.
Don't worry. No, they're not shutting down. We also have this called Mediterranean nights. It's kind of because it's getting warmer, right? So, but it's just that restaurants can be open late, so you can go out until next morning if you want. If you know the spots. I'm getting old now, don't know spots anymore so good, but no, it's kind of it has areas, but just certain areas where you can where it's very vibrant, and then it has certain area where it's very quiet, almost provincial. So I would say also that the city of Zurich is sometimes very provincial in some regards. Yes, but it's a particular type of cities, but that can be compared to other type of European cities.
Michael, how about you?
Yeah, I'll stay rather close, but I just moved 6 months ago from the city of Zurich to Dübendorf, which is a suburb of Zurich right at the city border, actually. And if we go there, you don't actually realize you're leaving the city, so it's really flowing into the agglomeration of Zurich. And yes, I think Dübendorf is really exemplary also of densification processes that are going on in Switzerland in general and specifically also in Zurich. So it has now around 30,000 inhabitants and experienced quite some urban densification, and with that also things like rising housing prices, urban renewal, and such things. And so we would start probably just right at the city border, where it is really urban, also has quite some skyscrapers that are even growing now, or there are added even more and more, and take our way through the town towards the rather rural area, direction of Lake Greifensee, which is then really just out in the green, where we don't really have the city anymore. And I think that is really showing you also the development process that is going on and gives you a really good view of how Switzerland or Swiss people live, because it gives you really the entire spectrum of really the rather urban, not maybe in American terms, but urban in Swiss terms, to the really rather rural living areas and also the high development. So the city actually grew within the last decade, I think, by more than 20% of inhabitants, and this is growing even more with positive and negative effects that it has and that you can really experience there.
Is that development mostly happening on previously kind of industrial land or lower density residential, or is it like undeveloped land that is becoming urban?
Yeah, no, it's mainly industrial land that the development is happening on. Also gardening companies that have been located there and that relocate now even further out of the city. Yeah,
seems like we don't have enough of those to be rebuilding here in the U.S. in our cities. Like, yeah, we don't have the whole neighborhood that's being redeveloped from an old industrial one most of the time. Or I guess when we do it, we just do it parcel by parcel, like in the Arts District.
Yeah, I was worried they were displacing those Swiss cats in the countryside. I love this. The Swiss farms have these, like, every farm has a cat sitting in the middle of the field. It's an amazing place. I don't know, at least where I went.
Usually more than one.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Usually the families around the farm can also kind of get a cat from there very easily.
Yeah.
They're happy if you take home a cat. Mm-hmm.
So the article we're discussing this week is titled Planning Instruments Enhance the Acceptance of Urban Densification, and it was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2022. Katrine Hofer is David and Michael's co-author on this one, and their study reports findings from an online survey of over 12,000 people in 6 cities, 3 in the US and 3 in Europe, and we'll talk about what those cities are in a little bit. And it tests which features of urban housing projects and associated planning instruments make people more or less accepting of them. Specifically, they use 2 experimental survey approaches to find out if people are less likely to oppose a new dense housing development if it's farther away from them, which would be sort of the NIMBY, not in my backyard effect, whether features of the development matter, like how big it is, who builds it, and if it advances climate goals, or whether it's accompanied by certain kinds of planning interventions like inclusionary zoning or rent control. Most findings, I think, are as we might expect. Just for example, everyone seems to dislike international for-profit developers, at least more than the alternatives. But we will also get to some pretty, I think, surprising results, at least, in the American case. But I think there are some surprising differences even among the European cities, among and between them as well. First, though, let's just map out the existing literature and knowledge base on this subject a bit. The paper starts with an interest in understanding local opposition to increasing density, because as you observe, living in denser places is more environmentally sustainable. And in some countries, of course, environmental sustainability is a really high policy priority. You also note that growing the supply of housing can improve affordability and also increase racial and economic diversity. I know this subject of many of our listeners are very supportive of urban densification, of infill, of building more housing. And so this question of, well, how do we actually get more people on board is a really, really important one to many of our listeners. So can you tell us what the previous research had to say about how people respond to dense housing development? Specifically, what does that research say about the importance of proximity and project characteristics? And then what gap in the research were you really trying to fill with your own study here?
So first of all, it's important to trace a bit the history of the concept of densification or the phenomenon in the discourse, but also in the discourse of practitioners, of planning scholars. It's an environmental concept, like gaining traction in the 1980s and 1990s. I mean, the origin was to combat urban sprawl. I think this is also in the US the case, but at least very strong in Europe. It's related to concepts such as the compact city or smart growth, I think, in the US. There are a number of other urbanism concepts coming up that are very closely related. And so it's so that some scholars say it's a synonym for the sustainable city, densification or the compact city.
Mm-hmm.
So in general, we would assume that it delivers a lot of good sustainability effects, especially regarding environmental sustainability by containing urban sprawl, reducing carbon emissions from traveling mostly, and also in Swiss context, very important, preserving unbuilt land. It should also add on housing supply, but this was not the original meaning of the concept, I would say. And so scholars and practitioners agree that a lot of us agree that we should have densification. So we have a high acceptance for the principle of densification, mostly with an environmental argument. We also see that in survey research, traditional kind of policy survey research of Swiss voters, so that we have very high acceptance or even support for densification, mostly when linked to the argument that we want to preserve the unbuilt land, the nature of Switzerland, and so on. So we have this very high general acceptance of it, but then a lot of us know that when it then is about implementing densification, it becomes very much tricky. And one line of research is this NIMBY, not in my backyard phenomenon, that the support vanishes when actually the implementation of densification comes closer to you. This is well-documented phenomenon that residents support densification theory, but then they oppose specific projects near there. This is especially the case, I would say, with home ownership. As a homeowner, you tend to overestimate negative potential impacts from changes in your surroundings, but it's also visible for other people, and this can also be a bit explained by behavioral theories, so that we are kind of very risk-averse sometimes. Yeah. But then we also felt that this NIMBY explanation and also a bit of the discourse of this YIMBY and NIMBY discourse is way too simple sometimes for us. He cannot really explain the conflict structure so well, or it's very reduced explanation of the conflict structure, and he cannot describe the more nuanced discussion among planners, but also about local population, how they want to implement densification. So I would say that we want to also kind of work with different ways of implementing densification. There can be very different way. Who is building? How they're building? For whom are they building? And also include local planning instruments or policy instruments to also see if planners and policymakers have some influence on the acceptance. And this was especially kind of triggered through 10 years of experience of densification in Switzerland. In Switzerland, I think it's one of the only country or the only country in the world where densification is a legally binding federal policy goal. And we are now 10 years into that federal policy goals. And there is a lot of discussion actually on implementing and different ways how to implement. And I think this is what we want to contribute to the literature. On the one hand, really testing the proximity argument again, but then adding on top of the proximity argument different ways how to implement densification.
It's interesting. I think here in a lot of the US, NIMBY now means much more than just the kind of narrow, I support housing, but not in my backyard, not in my neighborhood. I agree we need it, but not in my community. I feel like it's sort of come to just mean people, it just refers to people who oppose housing for any reason. It can be anything from, and I think this is like an unfortunate flattening of the word, where it can be anything from, you've got the people on the far end of the spectrum who are beyond NIMBYs. They're the bananas, the build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. And then you've got people who, maybe are open to development even in their own community, but they are very concerned about displacement or other issues that can be a real problem. And so they're all kind of lumped together. And in some ways, I think this line of research is teasing these different reasons for opposition or concerns apart.
Yeah, the densification topic in Europe, I think, is so different from the US that I'm really wasn't understanding it until living here and reading the scholarship about densification 10, 15, 20 years into these national projects in many European countries. So, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that in the Swiss case. I think that, it's an interesting parallel kind of conversation about densification in the US and in Europe. But in Europe, the governments are taking such a more active role, and municipalities are acquiring land and giving it to developers, and they're really leading this process in a way that in the US doesn't happen. And it's connected to this climate change fight here in Europe that is not happening in the US. I think, basically our plan in California is electric cars. Whereas here in France, for example, they have a number of different policies and different ways that are reshaping cities to make them more climate friendly. So I guess, I was going to ask you, since you've done a couple of related studies on this topic, whether there was like an inciting event for you on this or something specific that got you into this topic of urban densification, or is it just because of the policies and the actual densification happening that you focused on this topic?
Yes, I think that the starting point is really what David already mentioned, that we have in Switzerland this policy that is now in charge for 10 years. So we voted on this back in 2013, also with a quite vast majority. So I think all but one of the cantons, so the national subunits here in Switzerland were in favor of really densifying and thus protecting undeveloped land, right? Mm-hmm. And really densifying the cities, the urban.
Got to protect those farm cats.
Exactly, yeah.
Name and shame that one outlier, that one opponent.
Yeah, which canton didn't approve it?
That was Valle.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Valle has 70% of all people own land in Valle. And this is not the case. So it's a very high ownership rate. And if you have, building land is so valuable in Switzerland.
Right.
And
so there's a financial motivation.
Yeah, probably a financial.
Yeah. Switzerland and Germany are the two highest renter shares of the population in Europe, right?
Yeah, we have around 70% of renters in Switzerland, going as high as 90%, for example, in the city of Zurich. But yeah, still with that policy that we have in charge, we still struggle to actually get that densification done, right? Things like that, these NIMBY effects might still happen. So specific projects often fail due to local opposition or other reasons. And there wasn't really a direction of how to implement this in a decent way, also because competences are maybe not always clear, or it is in the competence of the municipalities themselves to actually implement that policies, and also on the cantonal level, but not really on a national level, right? And I think just in the last few years, densifying has a bit shifted of just densifying to densifying right, and to also include sustainability aspects, such as ecological and social sustainability.
Can I ask just what densification looks like in the Swiss context, or maybe the Zurich context specifically? Like, I'm assuming we're not necessarily talking about single-family homes on 5,000 or 7,000 square foot lots turning into 4 or 10 apartments or something like you might see in the US? Is it mostly that kind of fringe-y or formerly industrial kind of becoming 6 or 8-story buildings? Or is it lots of kind of 3 or 4-story townhouse style, row house style? Like, what does it really look like?
Yes, so it's a very important question. So, and it will change, and it is changing in the dense cities. So it was first of all, it was just that municipalities still had building reserves. They're not allowed to add on more building reserves, so they could technically still build on the fringes on Greenland or do some infill development. So the cheap or the easy ways that are still done also in cities. And
is a building reserve like what am I thinking of? Like a green belt, an area that you can't build anything? What is a building reserve?
yes.
Okay. And it's sort of just surrounding the city.
Surrounding the city, like you're now just allowed to have 10% of your land that you have can be future building land.
Okay.
So there's certain type of green field development possible, but this should be reduced.
Mm-hmm.
But there are still these reserves that's being built. We are doing now a study for the Federal Housing Office, and we see in the agglomeration municipalities and the suburbs, they are still densification for them still means building on the green field, but just do infill development, adding a bit on the fringes of the settlement. The second thing that happened is this brownfield development, so industrial development turning into housing. This happened a lot in the city of Zurich in the 2000s, for example, already. But these reserves are more or less kind of vanishing, at least kind of in the dense inner city. So there is not much industrial brownfield development anymore. And now it comes to the very contested transformation in existing settlements. So we have like 3-4-story houses getting teared down, and they're added maybe 1 or 2-story more. But these are not so sustainable now. And it's now really the question, okay, what are we doing with these buildings, like buildings from after the World Wars, 45 to 60s, they are now getting teared down. And this is a huge question because these are the affordable housing units now that are tackled. And what are we doing with the residents there? Should we tearing down based on CO2 emission and build new? How much can the building industry or should the building industry contribute to CO2 emissions? So it's now very much the question about how we can, like the socio-ecological transformation of the building, of how we build. And it's very contested because we also see a bit of negative impacts of densification, meaning kind of getting rid of old housing stock that is still affordable. And we have these discussions there, what should we do with them? And then we have the discussion that Pau also raised. What is the role of the state in it? Or should it be done through market actors? And in Switzerland, compared to other European countries, we still have very market-oriented development, not so much state-led than, for example, the Scandinavian countries, but also not as Paris, we have the municipalities, the cities are getting more active with acquiring land and buying up land. But this is a rather newer development now again, because they feel, okay, we need to have an active role in implementing densification.
Mm-hmm.
Super interesting. So I'm curious, when you started this particular project, because you had already been doing some work previously or at the same time on this issue of acceptance of densification in Switzerland. And so this project doesn't include Zurich. It includes 3 other European cities, not in Switzerland, and 3 US cities. So what made you choose these 6 cities to research this question?
Yes, we want to do both. So we want to have we want to do very local studies in Switzerland to really be relevant here for Switzerland because it's such an important topic. But then we also wanted to work comparatively to understand a bit what are other kind of planning contexts, but also what are similarities across planning contexts, because we think that in the big cities, the discourses are somewhat similar, problems are somewhat similar, and that's why we also wanted to have a comparative element. The Zurich case does not really fit these big cities. Zurich is a bit of a smaller cities, so we didn't want to include that, and we really want to see, okay, what are the major cities in North America and in Europe, what are they doing, or what is the perspective of the residents there? And we also, in this article, there is mainly the experimental part of it, but we also had a long descriptive survey part about the housing situation in this sixth city, where we ask a lot of questions about the housing situation, place attachment, neighborhood, if their perceived fear of having to move out. And this study, more the descriptive study, we just published beginning of this year in the Journal of the American Planning Association, more about housing precarity in this sixth city.
And I should, we're not trying to obscure the cities that we're talking about. I don't think we've actually said what they are. So let's say
wait till the end
six cities are Berlin, London, and Paris in Europe, and then New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago in the US. So we've established that. Now we know where we're talking about. All very large, important cities in both continents.
Yeah, so you got these 6 cities, you survey over 2,000 people in each one, and you use 2 kind of survey methods to ascertain how people feel about new dense housing projects. And one of them is, it's called a random frames, where you ask different people different framing devices for the project. So use that for the NIMBY effect. You say the project is in your neighborhood, or it's not in your neighborhood, but in your district, or it's not in your district. And then the difference in people's level of support between the people that are asked those questions can give you an answer to how important proximity is. The other piece you do is a conjoint. So I think this is a cool and increasingly used survey technique by housing scholars and political scientists studying housing. So maybe you can just talk about how the conjoint works in a way that's cool and accessible to non-research listeners.
Good luck.
I'll try. Yes. So yeah, I mean, you already mentioned how it worked. So specifically, also, it wasn't just showing the respondents whether it was in their own district or somewhere else, but it specifically stated the name of the district, because we first asked them where they live, right, and then randomized whether it is that or just another random district in the same city. And yeah, I mean, the combination of these experiments, I think that is also what was really the methodological contribution, so to say, is that we have this proximity effect in the overall frame and can test it in the conjoint itself. So we can see for each of the single attributes, be the densification itself, which has been done by scholars already, but also for other attributes such as whether there is mixed use, whether there are rent control requirements, or also who is the developer, etc., to see how this proximity effect actually plays out in the single attributes there.
Great.
Yeah, and I do think there's a forced choice element to this, where in that conjoint survey, people have to pick. And so they're given a series of characteristics on one hand, and then a kind of another set on the other. And one of those things might be, it's in your neighborhood versus district versus some other. But also, this one's mixed use, this one's just residential, this one is in a city where you have rent control, this one doesn't have rent control. It just kind of varies randomly. But I think having that forced choice at least allows you to kind of get a sense for ranking, not just do people support this overall or not. And I think that forces people to grapple with trade-offs a little bit more. So we gave a quick summary already, but let's have you give us a bit more detail on what you were testing. Again, you looked at how proximity, project level factors, and planning instruments affected support or opposition to proposed housing developments. What were the specific ideas that you tested in each of those 3 categories? And what were your expectations about how people would respond to those different options?
Yes, so the proximity frame we already discussed. So there it would be the classical argument and expectation that the closer to you, to your neighborhood, the densification project comes, the less likely you are accepting it. And then we had some project-related factors. So these are really characteristic that comes more with the building or with the project. And we wanted to see if this is important for residents. So how much denser it will get, what is the type of use, mixed use or not, we were testing. If the building has some kind of climate goals, related goals to it. So we have a lot of buildings being built, or at least kind of be pretend to build, which are wanted to reduce CO2 emissions from building then who is the project investor? So these are more kind of the characteristic of the project itself. Sometimes they are not in the hand of the local planner or the local policymakers. And then we added more planning instruments, we called them, but it's more kind of a random category of planning and policies, or like issues that are discussed in the literature. So these are rent control, if there is a rent control law in the city, if there is inclusionary zoning, meaning a couple of subsidized housing units for low-income people in the project, and what level of participation is there. And what we expected is actually that a lot of these project characteristics that go more towards ecological measures and social measures, they tend to be now more favored to add them to the housing project more generally. But for example, when it's about inclusionary zoning, so that you will get more low-income people in a project, and when this project then in a proximity frame that is close to you, so there we will have less acceptance. So we were testing actually a couple of expectations that we derived from the literature, from housing scholars around the world.
Yeah, that rent control versus inclusionary is a really clever way to get at that issue. In the US at least, and I don't think in Europe, like individual buildings aren't necessarily rent controlled, so that even though that's not a reality, it's a way to say, oh, look, these neighbors are going to be stable, but they're not necessarily going to be low income, versus in this other building, 20% of them are going to be low income, right? So it gets at different attributes of building characteristics.
Exactly, and it triggers a bit of rent control measure that can also be selfish. So you want to have rent control or because you fear of displacement, whereas inclusionary zoning, a lot of these residents or survey interviewees, they would not benefit from rent control, right? So we can tease a bit out if it's a very selfish motivation, rent control, or very selfish social motivation or not.
I think either Paavo or I misunderstood the rent control one. My interpretation of that one was not that this new building will be rent controlled necessarily. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. But you're posing that project as happening in a city with rent control so that, you know, if someone is a renter in that city or in that neighborhood, their home would be rent controlled. And so they would have a little more comfort, security that they're not going to have their rents increased, you know, if that's a concern, or be displaced somehow, to the extent rent control can help with that. Is it more of a citywide policy, or is this kind of posed to people as just relevant to that specific project?
Yeah, we specifically included that as a citywide policy, very much also inspired by the Mietzinsdeckel discussion in Berlin, which was
I noticed the Berlin results were different from the other cities.
Yeah.
They've been thinking about rent caps.
That discussion was highly driving
I
that.
See.
But yeah, as you just mentioned, the idea was really also for citizens that are not living directly in that building, right? That they have some security, or that they don't have to fear rent increases such as based on spillover effects by some segregation, gentrification processes that might go on.
Yeah. Either one, I mean, I think to Paavo's point, like either way you do it, it's sort of setting up different winners and losers. And so it is asking different questions from inclusionary zoning, which I think makes it very interesting seeing the results next to each other.
Yes, I think this way we also see the self interest in the rent control, right, versus the inclusionary zoning, which then is really specifically for the project that is developed, which you as a respondent wouldn't even be profiting for directly when it comes to rents, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just to add, but as you know, there are very different forms of rent control in different cities, and we kind of took a couple of variation into conjoint element, but in generally, like in a lot of European cities, but I don't know, obviously every European cities, the new housing would also be subject of rent control over the years. So normally you can set a higher prices if you build new, but then this unit is also rent controls. I mean, there are several different measures, but yeah, a lot of European cities, it gets complicated. These are path-dependent laws,
right.
And yeah, it's a bit of a mix.
Yeah, I'm just thinking because like in the U.S., I mean, in California, you know, they tried to pass rent control ballot initiative and it was voted down. So I wonder I was surprised a bit that it had a favorable impact on people's support in L.A., but I guess we'll get there in the results.
Yeah. And It's a pretty common proposal by many rent control or rent stabilization proponents to say, like, we don't need to rent control new housing, in part because we recognize that might actually discourage the construction of new housing, which we want to happen. But maybe 15, 20, 25 years after it's completed, it can kind of age into that program, at which point it's not going to go off the market if it's not a crazy strict rent control law. So you're kind of getting the security, but you still got the thing to be built in the first place. So we've talked about two of the planning instruments in a little bit of detail, the rent control and inclusionary zoning. We haven't really talked about what the participatory planning or public engagement aspect of this is. And so you had various different options for that, for how people could be involved in the project or maybe the broader planning of their community. So what options were people given, and kind of how were you thinking about those options when you were creating them?
Yeah, so we had these different attribute characteristics for the public participation that all somewhat showed a way for residents to participate in that project development, and especially in the planning of the project development. And this somewhat ranges from no participation at all, so involvement of residents is not happening, to simply information events where the citizens will get some information presented at one particular event without actually being able to voice their issues, but at least, they have a direct contact. And then two more involving ones, one really the involvement in the planning and the implementation of the densification project, where residents should really be able to have a say in how this is going to be developed, in how this is going to play out. And then also the last one, which is really a veto point in residents having the power to vote in the project decision in the end, whether it will be implemented or not.
Yeah, that's a strong participation level. Having people just vote on every individual project. It does happen in some cities here in the U.S., and not surprisingly, those cities do not build a lot of housing. But can I just follow up on the planning and implementation option here? So I think that could be interpreted different ways. You know, what does it mean to be involved in project planning? Is it like the developer comes to the neighborhood with a proposal and then they can really have a lot of input on, well, we want this or that to be changed and so on? Or is this like a step above or before, which is kind of where I tend to think we should prioritize public engagement and participation, which is at the community planning process. It's like we're developing a plan for our entire neighborhood, what we want to allow, what we don't want to allow, what we want to incentivize. But once we get to the project proposal period and the entitlement and permitting and everything, the public does not have much of a role there. Is this sort of one or the other? Is it both?
First of all, I want to say in Switzerland, we have to vote on every planning and house, or almost every planning and housing project. So we have direct democratic vote on planning and housing. But no longer you have
to go to the town square and raise your hand to vote?
In some we have, like in some municipalities.
I'm saying that because I went to the town where you do that. It's amazing.
You went to Appenzell,
I went to Appenzell,
yeah. So, I mean, when they confirm to the building and zoning law, we don't have to vote on it, but changes to the building and zoning order and special land use plan, we have to vote on it.
Right.
And a lot of densification has to happen now through different means than the zoning laws.
Because of the vote?
Yes, and because the zoning laws are rather, as you also know, rather not dynamic enough to actually enable to engage in urbanization processes so much. So they are also just zoning and saying what kind of stories, but normally you want to add up a lot of different plots together and densify in a more neighborhood scale way. So this is all has to be all voted upon. And we have another part of the Swiss National Science Project is actually collecting all these votes from all 162 Swiss towns and cities to over 20 years. So we have a lot of coders who help us to make sense what changed over time through these local ballots. So And this was also a bit of inspired, obviously, the last point the people vote upon on the Swiss experience. And I think you alluded to that as well. In the US, you also have this a bit that sometimes you have to vote on it. And I think in these circumstances, it's a lot important that you have a lot of upstream participation already, as you explained, like more in the community planning development already in there. And then on the project level, you also have a bit of participation, but more kind of voluntarily, or people who wants to voice their opinion a bit. So I think in Switzerland, participation is kind of a process that goes through all stages of the densification process. It's sometimes annoying and sometimes it leads to blockages, but it's also a very kind of more a tradition of involving residents. And I think the whole scale we ask is obviously a bit of inspired by, the old concept of the ladder of participation, but the newer ones where you have more intensive form of participation. And this is what we want to look a bit at. Participation also as a democratic measures, but it doesn't make so much of a difference in the results if I want to already preview the results, but it's maybe also a bit of a overwhelming and too complicated, too nuanced question maybe.
Yeah, that might be one reason that the results don't show up as being very large, and I think connected maybe with the rent control one as well, where you're asking about do you support this building happening, and then it connects to these larger issues, maybe too much of a stretch for people. Can I ask a question of you guys we didn't prepare for, but since we've been talking about Switzerland a lot, how many housing units are built per year in Switzerland, and what's the population?
I have to look it up.
Okay, well, if it's a 10, forget it.
They are missing 50,000 every year, so this is the discourse.
Because I'm just curious about how you have a national law that says you have to densify, and that seems like it has led to new projects happening in Swiss cities. That's my impression. Where you live, maybe, Michael. So, how did they convince all of these points of democracy in the planning process to approve of the densification?
Yeah, so I don't know the numbers, but it's a bit of a watered down densification then in the end, right? So it's kind of a compromise of densification. There is still densification possible, like with infill densification or very limited densification within the zoning laws that you once voted upon. But there is a lot of special land use plan that are voted on.
And from your data on the votes, have you already got a sense of what percent are yes and no?
Yes, it's overwhelmingly yes. So it's kind of becomes a bit so that you vote on 5 times a year in a smaller cities to 10 times a year on planning issues, from building the local school through very technical amendments in the zoning law, through financial issues so that the municipality want to acquire this piece of land, to planning projects sometimes even, and this predominantly yes, because it's very technocratic.
So you vote 5 times a year?
We vote 5 times to 6 times a year, 4 times.
Is it you vote online?
No, by letter. Well, or you can go to the ballot itself.
Okay. And what percent of the population participates in these elections? What's the voting rate?
About 40 to 60%, depending on the issue. I think last ballot was around 60%, but there we also voted on some rather social security pension fund, and to revising that really mobilized people. Wow. But 60% is would be high, yeah. And
on the local level, there can be also 30%.
Yeah, okay. Not 15% like LA.
There are also democratic problems with it because we have 30% plus foreigners that are not allowed to vote. You are only allowed to vote if you're nationalized, and it's rather hard to...
I've heard it's very hard to become Swiss.
Yes, so there is a lot of problems attached also to this.
Yeah. Interesting.
I'm looking at the Swiss statistics website, and it seems that there are about 4.7 million dwellings in the country, which is a very large number for a population of 8.7 million. It's less than 2 people per household, and they built about 45,000 units in 2021, so about 1% growth rate in dwelling units, which is not amazing, but
better than California.
And it always depends very much on demand and how many people are having children and who's dying and how much immigration there is. And I don't know nearly enough about the country to weigh in on whether that's enough. So let's jump into the results here. There's a lot to talk about, but can you give us some of the highlights of the main findings, things that stood out to you, some of the stuff you think is most important to comment on here?
First of all, I would say it's the NIMBY effects was visible, but not to a very big extent. I mean, it's statistical significant, but it's not changing a lot of the results. It's visible with regard to density. So the more density we would propose in a project through these conjoint experiments, the more density comes to you, drives down acceptance. So this is very much in line with previous finding, but then it's not just about density. It's not just about rejecting high density. It's also the different building characteristics is also very important. And then we would say mixed use is more accepted. I think this is also a dominant discourse in planning in 30 years. So we should do mixed use. So this is not really contested.
And what's the sort of rationale behind that? Why do we think that buildings that include restaurants, stores, bars, whatever on the ground floor are more appealing to people on average than just a straight up dwellings only kind of building?
I think it's this resurgence of urban life. So that's actually people want to live in the city, that seek kind of this diversity and they seek kind of closeness, proximity, walkability, don't want to have a car. And so people that search the urban lifestyle in today's time, they want to have everything very close by. And I think this is a bit the rationale behind this mixed use.
Mm-hmm. We also see that in our other research, right, where we look at Switzerland and look at these different amenities, specifically also depending on where people live. And there we also see somewhat a decrease of preferences for mixed use. It's still high somewhat, but less so than in urban areas, because things like urban greenery, privacy, and so on become way more important also on the rural side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And that, just to point the difference, it's like 48% approval with only apartments and something like 51-52% approval with mixed use. So 4 percentage points more or less across all of these cities.
Yeah, and when you look at the individual cities, even, people might think like, oh, that maybe that's true in London or Paris or New York, but not Los Angeles. But Los Angeles as well, there's certainly still a preference, maybe smaller somewhat, but a preference for mixed use versus apartment only. All right, next section.
So the somewhat surprising result is what we already were talking a lot about, is this rent control versus inclusionary zoning one, so that both actually are positively drive up acceptance. And also if inclusionary zoning is coming close to you. And I think this was kind of interesting to see, but also was something that we think is kind of something that is somewhat positive, so that it's not just about, okay, my rent unit is controlled, so we are not kind of in the self-interest explanations, but it's something about, okay, there is an increasing awareness that some people, especially low-income people, need some sort of stability and security to come with this densification process. And I think this is a bit what we find out, and I think this is also something actually exciting to see.
I'm glad you think so highly of your fellow humans, but I interpret the rent control thing a little differently. I feel like it's more about the stability than people being altruistic and wanting to help lower income people particularly. I feel like, there's a bias to want stability in your neighborhood. And if you give rent control, even if a lot of rent control benefits middle and upper income renters, and then they're more likely to stay, and that might be what people want.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just a combination of rent control drives up acceptance and inclusionary zoning.
Right.
So rent control can be very selfish and just protecting your own unit. And also, as a lot of scholars were showing, also maybe are not so good for investment in some contexts. But then on top, we have very similar results for inclusionary zoning that is not likely to benefit you. And the combination of these two results is actually what makes us optimistic.
Can I just go back to the proximity effects? I wonder what your reaction, because it was like 2 percentage points more support on average across all these places when a project was not in your district. Did you expect bigger effects, or was that more or less what you were thinking?
No, I mean, that was definitely something somewhat surprising. I mean, based on existing research, we would have definitely expected larger effects. But I think it also shows a bit that with somewhat nuanced projects that we showed here, right, that might both reflect social and sustainability goals, adhering to climate goals and so on, that if projects include those, this NIMBY effect might also somewhat decrease.
Right.
I wonder if you were able to ask people about like kind of the strength of their feeling, positive or negative, if that might play a role in this as well, where maybe, it's only as you get closer to someone's home, only a few more people feel negatively about it, because most people are kind of like, I'm either generally supportive or generally opposed no matter what. But as it gets closer, you really bring out the people who feel very strongly, the ones who are going to show up, organize their neighbors, call their council member, all that kind of thing, where maybe we're really talking about a pretty small number of people who are influencing the process. I mean, that's just factually what we see here, in terms of who's organizing against these things. It's very small shares of the population, but they're very noisy. They're the only ones really activated because people don't really get super fired up to come support a development, understandably, but they certainly get fired up to oppose it.
I encourage people to go download from the website of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science the appendix to this, because you can look for these different cities exactly kind of how the different parts of the survey elicited more or less support and opposition. It seems like kind of the biggest effect was in a few cities, just the size of the project. Really, you could see almost 10 percentage points in Paris and London if the project is 20% bigger than the building there versus 100% bigger than the building there, which kind of makes sense because Paris and London are very concerned about historical buildings and the historical characteristic of the city. But I was kind of surprised for my hometown of Los Angeles, California, the project size effect was actually pretty small. Any thoughts on the difference in the effect of project size across these cities?
No, not so much, but it's actually, thanks for reading an appendix. So it's always
I'm so excited to see the details.
We always think we write it for the reviewers only, but it's good to go through it. I mean, I'm actually didn't look at the appendix for a year or two. So, but now two things maybe here to say. So we also have all the survey data online open access. So if somebody is interested to look at one city more specifically, you can download all the data. We have like data briefs for all the 6 cities. You can download and use it. If you're a student, use it for your master thesis or whatever you want. So this is kind of what we want. And actually to also engage a bit more with local experts and to look at.
Yeah, I mean, just the one idea is, since you did it by percent, if you increase the size of a typical building in LA by 100%, you're just making a single family home into a big single family home. But if you're doing it in Paris, you're going up to 14 stories. So maybe that's one reason.
I want to make sure that we talk about who's building it and the impact that has on support or opposition. The 4 options you gave were it's a government investor, a nonprofit investor, a national investor, or an international investor. And so I think in some ways the results here are what people might expect, but there were some surprising ones. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, for sure. I mean, we generally see, and you already mentioned that in the introduction, right, that international for-profit investors gain the least acceptance and have the most negative effect, actually, on the acceptance. On the other side, it's non-profit developers that, on average, gain most acceptance. But I think where it becomes really interesting is if we look at the comparison by cities, right? So there we really see some divide between the 3 European cities, as well as the 3 US cities. So in the US, the project developer has less of an effect. Still, the pattern is somewhat similar. But for example, in Berlin, the international for-profit investor really falls short by, on average, I think 10% less or even more.
It's kind of just off on its own on the left side of this chart.
It increased the figure quite a bit to the left there, yeah. And I think that is really what is striking to me also, to see these differences. And I think these are also the biggest differences if we look at the otherwise rather coherent results over all these 6 cities.
And this has for sure something to do about the role of the state in the production of housing.
Mm-hmm.
That is kind of in European countries historically very much the case. And I would assume, but you are more kind of the expert in North America, that there is more private market-oriented development. And we have
almost
kind
exclusively.
of now, almost, yeah. And we also, I mean, there are successful programs from the state. Some are also less successful. And from housing cooperatives is a big thing in a lot of European countries. And so the discussion now shifted a lot since the last 10 to 5 years, also in the big city, that actually they want to see densification implemented more by the public. If the public wants to do more density, increase the density, meaning also tearing down old, still affordable housing, they have to make sure that these affordable housing units are still there, so subsidized housing units.
Right.
And this is a big discussion. For example, yesterday I was just at the talk of the National Housing Ministry of the Netherlands, and they have a huge national housing programs, want to invest a lot of money to support municipalities to build housing below market rate. So this is kind of a very big deal in Europe.
I do want to say here that the U.S. cities, there's much less of a gap between the nonprofit, for-profit, government. And in fact, as I'm looking at it, most of the cities, this may not even be statistically significant, but the national for-profit is actually the highest supported compared to government, compared to nonprofit, compared to international for-profit. And I think these are all kind of within the margin of error, but it's very different from Berlin in particular, where like the for-profit are just all the way to the left, really opposed. And again, I feel like maybe the recent, striking down of the rent control law, and this is just like in the news. And so I think private in for-profit is very much vilified right now, and maybe for good reason. But it's interesting seeing that result. And I actually think it's really important to say for anyone who is not going to look at this chart or either of these charts, just looking at the results overall, the U.S. cities, this is, I think most people will be surprised to hear this, they are significantly more supportive in general. Even, the least popular project characteristics and so forth are supported by a higher share of the U.S. survey participants than the most supported project characteristics and other things in the European cities by and large. And I think that's just, I don't know what to say about that. That might just be
that shocking. I would call that Shane, you edited my earlier question in the intro of this episode because I put shocking. When I first saw this paper, that was one thing that intrigued me very much. And I want to hear what you guys think about why.
Are we just optimistic here?
I mean, well, I have a theory, but I'll let you guys go first.
First of all, this, to the Berlin case again, we already talked about very high rate of renters. And I think renters are kind of a bit the ones that feel densification or that are at least pressured under densification. So there is kind of a fear of being evicted due to densification. And we see that. We can visibly see that also in Switzerland. And we can see patterns of that. And it's mostly low-income renters that are being displaced. And this is the discussion a lot in European cities. So densification as a concept is still supported environmentally, but socially it's very much contested as well, or how it's implemented. And I think this is at least a discourse together with a high share of renters, together with a strong history of state-led production of housing, so that it's now a lot of supported densification when it's being done by the state, or at least when there are some measures implemented by the state to protect some of displacement that comes from densification. That would be a bit more my interpretation, but I'm limited to the understanding of the North America, so I'm curious about your theory.
Yeah, I think, I mean, and it actually, this point you just had brought up, Shane, about government-built projects not being more favorable in the U.S. Well, the government doesn't build housing in the U.S., or at least it hasn't for 50 years. And so I think a little bit might be just the context from which people are responding. And there aren't, most people in Los Angeles and Chicago are not living anywhere near or barely ever see large-scale densification projects. Like if you're living in Zurich, you might go near, some of the new projects that are happening in your city. And so not having the experience close by in the US these days maybe would lead people to just be like, oh yeah, sure, I would accept that. But it's because it's not, happening near them right now.
There's a little bit of, we just don't have the same kinds of development, not just that we don't have government building housing directly, but I think the way that we would think about government invested housing is like public housing, which I think is what you're referring to, Pavo, where it's really the government kind of leading and building it. But, this is actually government investor, nonprofit investor. The way it works here is like the government invests the money, but the nonprofit builds it, or the for-profit in many cases builds the low-income housing. We don't have like a nonprofit that builds housing without government funding, really. Nonprofits are the government builder at some level, whereas in many European countries, you actually have nonprofit builders who, or limited profit. There's just like kind of different models entirely. And so I think people who hear this still kind of in the US have a sense for what is meant by government versus nonprofit, but the European reader versus the American reader looking at these results is probably thinking about somewhat different things.
Just very quickly, I think while we're talking about what is interesting about comparative urban research, there are certainly also limits to comparative urban research, so that we cannot model the context so much,
Right.
and that people think in their context and neighborhood, but they have to adhere to kind of questions developed and designed from some dudes from Zurich, Switzerland. Although, I mean, we talk to experts and try to make it more general as good as we could, but I mean, there are also limits to it,
Yeah.
and I think...
Yeah.
Well, and even if,
this, I don't think this was intended as a critique.
No,
it's
not
just
at all. And
kind of
no.
it's recognizing those
even if you
limits,
had
yeah.
a perfect knowledge of all of these cities, it would be impossible to design a single survey that would be applicable in all the same places in the same way, right? So you can make it as general as possible, but then you're removing some of the local context necessarily. So just to summarize the project and planning features that were most accepted versus least accepted, could you just give me like the typically best project and the typically worst project from the respondents' point of view?
Yes, sure. So over all the cities, we see that the most accepted proposal would be one with the lowest population densification, so 20%, with mixed usage, and in this case, really with mixed use with entertainment, restaurants, cafes, and bars, although this is just slightly different to the other mixed usage attribute characteristics. Then that would be a non-profit investor. Although we just talked about this is different between the US and Europe. It includes climate goals. It has a rent cap as a rent control measure, so a full rent control measure, not just a maximum increase of some certain percents there. And it has the maximum of inclusionary zoning, so that 20% of the newly developed project are actually going to low-income households, ensuring somewhat social mixes there. And last but not least, planning and implementation, so involvement of residents in both planning and implementation receives the highest share in that project. Still here again, this is very close to all the other public involvement attributes that we see, as long as it's not no involvement, which would be the least preferred one.
I felt very seen on that last one where voting was not particularly popular. People didn't want that level of involvement. It was just like, I don't want to vote on every project. I don't think most people want to be involved at that level. I think in theory, people like the idea of like being as involved as possible and always being consulted. But then, you're voting on 20 ballot initiatives in a single election and you're just like, actually, maybe you don't need to run every single one of these things by me. There's so much more we could talk about this. And I really encourage our listeners to look up the paper because, even if you don't read the thing, there are two really great charts that summarize almost everything we've been talking about, and you can kind of just see what stands out to you. But, I got to ask the question of what we do with these findings, because, I think just for some examples, people may be more supportive of a 20% increase in density than 100%, but increasing density by 100% or often a lot more at the kind of project level is necessary in many cases. Inclusionary requirements can increase support for housing, but they're sometimes associated with less production and higher rents and prices in that city. And you have a similar issue with more and more and more public participation. I think in cases where there aren't really visible large trade-offs, like including mixed uses in buildings, this seems like a pretty straightforward, let's do more of that. But when that support comes at the expense of maybe we're going to build less housing and everyone's rents are going to go up for that reason. And so we've got more support for what we are building, but we're building less. Like, that's a very steep cost to pay. So how do you think about these things, especially the ones where there are really clear or at least likely trade-offs to getting that extra support?
So first of all, it's maybe not about one concrete project and all the little characteristic. What we also want to show is that you can kind of increase the support for densification with a range of different measures. Some are in the hand of a project developer, some are in the hands of the government or planners. And I think it's important to see that, and it's important also that we are now starting to discuss more ecological and social issues, and that when we densify, people really want to see these more strong sustainability effects. This is also what we can see in the Swiss debate. But I would also argue that I think if we start to densify, especially if we have to tear down buildings, so it's not about infill development or fringe development. If we tear down existing building, then we need to have large densification gains to actually make an impact. And I think if we have large densification gains, this automatically drives down acceptance, but then also kind of different project characteristic or planning instruments, regulatory measures can help to bring up also a very large project. And I think this is now it's a very trade-off discussion, but I think we should go for large density increases, but then it needs kind of additional instruments to harness the support for this large density increase.
Yeah. And I do think, to put a positive spin on this, I think this shows at some level people are willing to support projects. You know, they're movable. There are things that you can do. And these planning instruments in particular are trying to address people's legitimate concerns about security, about displacement, about having a diverse community, whether racially or socioeconomically or otherwise. And when you take steps toward or show some intent to address those concerns, more people are willing to come along. And whether it needs to be inclusionary zoning or rent control or these specific planning instruments, I think that's up for debate, but it does show that there is real potential there and that it's not necessarily just about people's purely selfish interests either. There's a kind of maybe broader social interest that a lot of people have in this as well.
Well, this is super interesting research, guys, and I just wanted to ask a final question because I know when I was doing a survey experiment once upon a time similar to this.
This was our first episode.
Yeah, this is a cool coming full circle. I pretty quickly wanted to do another survey because there was a few things I wish I had included, and the answers that I got already were creating more questions. So I wanted to see what follow-up you've done, or whether you've done follow-up, or kind of what this project has led to.
Yes, definitely. I mean, also we already in that project itself, the data set is so large and allows us to do even more analysis. So we have two other paper projects also based on this data set, where we delve more into the individual effects. So the first one is really individual effects that are driving acceptance of such projects, where we test for different demographics, but also political attitudes.
Okay.
And this is allowed actually by including this acceptance of each of the proposals, right? That allows us to estimate the individual effects for each individual and somewhat attribute a utility for each of the attributes to these respondents. And there we actually see that it's also a highly politicized issue.
Interesting.
So it's really left-right or...
And so what are the more conservatives or more supportive or less supportive?
Overall, the conservatives are more supportive, if I'm not mistaken now, but it's...
But not the rent control part.
Yeah, exactly. It's becoming specifically more interested when we go to the different attributes, right? So left or liberal ones wanting to regulate more, the right conservative ones being more in favor also, for example, for-profit investors.
Sure.
But yeah, for the densification, it's somewhat surprising that it's, or at least I didn't expect that it's the right or conservative ones that are even more accepting of the
You hang out with California Democrats long enough, and you might not be surprised.
and it's a conflict. It's a conflict about regulation and deregulation, and how much state invention and involvement should be there or not. And I think this is also what's already you, Paavo, a bit described in some of your paper. And I think this is very strongly that we think it's very the politics of densification is about the implementation and how much state involvement is there or how much free market drives the densification.
Yeah, super interesting. So that paper is published or it's...
It's under review right now, cool. Yes.
Right on.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we have another one that is still a work in progress, so that we will hopefully submit soon. So we also had an open text field at the end of the conjoint experiment where we asked respondents why they decided in favor of one or the other project. There was kind of an experiment to see what that gives us, but we were able to use some natural language processing methods to mirror that, right, with the results from the experiment itself, and it gives us some new insights. So, for example, we touched a bit on that regarding the public involvement thing, where we see that it's not really about participation for the respondents, but rather because they want to have that others in their community at least have a say in that, because it's connected to their belief that this way their amenities will be somewhat protected, right? But it's not like they want to necessarily participate in the entire project.
That's super interesting. I don't want to vote, but other people should.
Yeah. I want us to build public transportation for someone else to use.
Yeah, it's a little bit interesting.
And it's also a lot of people want to voice their concerns. And I think also participants that are kind of wrote a lot of stuff into the open text field, for them also participation was more important. So also a bit the function of participation to be involved somewhat was important.
Interesting.
So you're saying the person who was likely to fill out the open text field is also the kind of person who's likely to show up to a public hearing and voice their concerns?
Yes, so but it was a bit more nuanced than that. It's not just about the frequency, but the persons that actually commented on how the project would kind of affect the community, and not only negatively, but wants to just give their opinion. They were kind of more in favor of participation.
Interesting.
So.
Yeah. I feel like that's a fairly consistent finding, that just giving people the opportunity to kind of share their views often builds up support. And then it's just, how do you balance that with not giving people too many veto points and kind of getting the input, but not necessarily shutting things down? All right, we will have to stop there. David Kaufmann and Michael Wicki, thank you again for joining us on the Housing Voice podcast.
Thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.
You can read more about David and Michael's work on our website, lewis.ucla.edu. Show notes and a transcript of the interview are there too. The UCLA Lewis Center is on social media. I am on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and Pavo is at L. Pavo. Thanks for listening. We will see you next time.